Welcome to Gregorian Chat.
Yeah, it was off. It was always going to be off. Kia ora.
Hello! Welcome to this podcast.
Oh,
Just excluded me right there.
well, you were
Right
drinking
from the
tea
beginning.
as we were
Tea.
saying the greetings.
Anyway, namaste, everyone.
Hey, I like it.
I was going to go.
This is Gregorian Chat, the podcast where we don't have a tagline.
We came with a tagline.
Did we?
Yeah, it became our tagline.
The podcast where it's all about, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, anyway, so welcome to the podcast where it's all about stuff. And this is our third episode in our three-part series on Is the Catholic Church Homophobic?
Mm-hmm.
So far we've talked to Brendan Malone, we've talked to Father Chris, and now we have Andrew Dawson.
Thank you for having
From
me.
Dawson's Creek.
Yes.
You're
Yes.
bringing back traumatic memories
Yeah.
from childhood.
Yeah.
Was that always put upon you?
That was it. It was either that or Andy Pandy.
Oh,
How did you get that? Oh, Andrew.
Yeah, Andrew. Yeah.
I just forgot your name, momentarily. Andy Pandy.
Yeah,
Tell me,
exactly.
Watch Andy Pandy as a
Exactly.
homeschooler.
Anyway, so Andrew, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
What do you want to know?
So, where do you come from? What do you do? Why do we have you here?
Right.
In that order.
In that order, okay. Well, I come from, or was born in India originally and grew up in Dubai.
Okay.
Lived here for
Did you?
most of my life. And yeah, what else can I say? I was once president of one version of a Catholic society
Really?
here at the university. So yeah, and what else? Now I work within an NGO, and I guess I'm here because you needed a practicing homosexual to talk to. So yeah.
That was the plan. Yeah.
We had a couple of veterans, but we're like, we need someone who's still practicing.
Yeah.
Because they don't have it all together yet.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
Anyway.
Exactly. We're perfecting our art. No, I'm joking.
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
Aren't we all?
Yeah.
But yeah, so essentially, we didn't want this discussion that is 3 episodes long to be one-sided, and we thought, well, the perfect person to come on the podcast is someone who ticks as many of the boxes as possible. Andrew is Catholic and also gay, and so it's good.
Catholic in the same sense that most Catholics are, I
Right.
think, if I'm honest. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so that might be a good place.
As an Easter Christmas.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Well, that might be a good place to start, though, because you've been quite involved with the Anglican Church, or
Yes.
is it just the choir?
That's right. I sing in the Anglican Cathedral in Parnell, and I sing in the choir there. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I'm a refugee, if you like.
Ah.
Yeah.
Cool.
That is a very good choir.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, well, Anglicans love their music,
Well, that Anglicans actually. The reason why I sing with them is because they sing all the Catholic music.
Well, yeah.
that,
Yeah.
that,
Well,
that you guys don't sing. So.
yeah, it's true. Yeah. Well, I mean, didn't we write all the music anyway, and then the Anglicans came along?
Well, yeah. I mean, but British choral music is also pretty good. So even after that. So.
That's true.
That's
Yeah.
true. As evidence.
But that's a different podcast.
Oh, royal
yeah,
wedding.
yeah,
Yeah, never
yeah.
mind. Yeah, actually, weddings are a good place to. No, I'm joking. I don't want.
Gay marriage? No. That's not
No,
really it.
no.
But,
So yeah,
we're starting at the basics.
We've talked so far about. We got Brendan to talk about the theological side of it.
Yeah.
And Father Chris to talk about a more pastoral approach. And you've watched both those podcasts, am I right?
I have. That's right.
Yeah, and so I guess start off with what's your kind of impression after having watched those?
My impression, gosh, if you want a review, I thought they were very interesting, and I really commend both of you for having this kind of extended discussion on a difficult topic, no doubt. I must admit, if I'm like to be honest, and I must admit I enjoyed Father Chris's episode a lot more.
Yeah.
Than Brendan's, and that's probably just because Brendan and I don't really see eye to eye on the matter, which is fine because a lot of my good friends don't see eye to eye with me on a lot of things.
Sure.
But yeah, and in fact, I'd say that if you want a sort of answer, a conditional answer to start with about whether the Catholic Church, what's the specific question again?
Is the Catholic Church homophobic?
Is the Catholic Church homophobic? Well, there's so many different ways to really get that point across, right? So you can you can look at it in terms of institutionally, and then you can look at it in terms of individually. And I would actually say that my own experience has been that most of the Catholic priests that I know, at least in this diocese, I have found to be very welcoming and actually have a really good pastoral attitude. And I think Father Chris's talk with you kind of displayed that, at its best. So that's one side. And then when it comes to the laity as well, I'd say that by and large, I'd be willing to bet that most laity would be absolutely fine. And then there's always going to be this sort of minority where the welcome isn't quite as welcoming as it could be, if you like. Yeah.
Which is an interesting point, considering that the priests really are the ones who, I guess, know the most about their parishioners, and they get to see a side of things because commonly what comes into this discussion is the whole element of sin, and it's like, the priest, like a lot of lay people might get very scandalized even by the topic of homosexuality because they're like sin, but priests deal in that stuff every day, and so it's not like in the same way, even if...
Well, absolutely. I mean, priests, and I mean, any, with even outside the bounds of the Catholic Church, anyone in a position of that kind of advisory, guidance style role, in this sense, that pastoral role, will have to deal with the fact that, there's just, you've got to have a thick skin to deal with a lot of different things.
And Father Chris kind of addressed that when he was saying, like, if you're going to preach about this, or you're going to talk about, like, homosexuality being a sin, is like, well, you also have to talk about every other sin being a sin.
Right.
Which it kind of gets on the point which Brendan kind of ended on, which, the Catholic Church shouldn't treat like people from like homosexual same-sex attraction differently, because we should treat everyone who's a sinner as a sinner, and we should love them all, in the same way that we should love them. What's your impression on that kind of stance of it all?
On that side of things? Yeah, well, so I would first of all, I agree actually with Brendan on this point. Although one of my pet peeves is this idea that the identity politics side of the LGBT world has to do with the sort of Marxist collectivism, because strictly speaking, Marxism is an economic question, not a cultural one. And in fact, what I would say is that a lot of the opposition to that kind of corporatization of the LGBT cause as this kind of marketable thing to go, hey, my company's really pro whatever it is.
Gay TMs.
Gay TMs, all that kind of stuff. Like, I mean, a lot of that is very much opposed from the left. Yeah. But back to the question at hand, I guess I would agree with Father Chris in saying that, if you have a particular moral standard, there is a kind of need to be consistent across the board. And I think Brendan's also right in that, as a gay person, I don't really particularly want to be treated any differently. But I think that's where that problem comes in, because I would say for a lot of gay people, the treatment that you tend to get is a little bit biased, at least from my own experience, and that there is a sort of tendency to think that, say, things like gay marriage destroying the family, or ideas like that, to which I would just respond, well, you guys are doing it all by yourselves. You've got tremendously bad divorce rate going on. So, 5% of the population is really not a threat to an entire edifice.
So
and
it's a bit like scapegoating, a bit kind of like, there's
I
a
think
problem
so.
with marriage, it's the gays.
Well, I mean, I don't think people really do that. And I don't really want to misrepresent anyone here. But what I'm sort of saying is that we can tend to overblow the importance of some of these issues when it comes to daily life. Like, for instance, me being gay is one very important, but not ultimately, it doesn't define every part of me.
Right.
And there's a lot more that kind of we come to share in our common humanity that I think tends to get de-emphasized, and then this question of sexuality gets really overemphasized on all sides. Yeah, so that's where the polarization comes in, from my view.
Sure. And coming back to Brendan's point there, which is, that the church shouldn't treat anyone differently. or any group of people rather, differently from another group fundamentally, But like you mentioned, there are some ways in which it's you can't help but the fact that if someone who was in a heterosexual relationship came to, let's say, a priest or someone saying we want to get married, then naturally the priest will say, well, okay, great, you should consider. I mean, they might ask a few questions first, hopefully,
sure.
And then eventually might get to the point where they say, oh, you should go to marriage counselling and make it official, if that's where you go. Whereas that can't happen, and a Catholic priest can never...
Marriage. A Western arrangement. A dweeb within a dweeb. Yeah. Anyone who gets that reference gets one.
But anyway, so I guess in a few fundamental ways, like you say, are those the things you're talking about, or are they more the small things where people are not so much giving you the time of day, or is it more the big things like that which put up a barrier? Because I know we said, the reality is for a lot of homosexuals that the church is not a welcoming place, no matter how much we say, we're welcoming and we're not going to judge you and we're not going to...
I think this is true. So I can address both sides of that issue. On the question of sort of the optics and the rhetoric, I think that's definitely somewhere where the church can do a lot of good. In fact, I in preparation for all this, because I was just reading up, I haven't been all au fait with what's been going on in the church recently. But I did read something from the Bishop of Auckland, Patrick Dunn, where he talked about this, I think, at the end of last year, and pointed out the need to sort of move away from the kind of language of, I don't mean to pick on you, but homosexual isn't really, at least in English-speaking countries, a term that people tend to like. The same goes for the idea of, struggling with same-sex attraction, things like this, or perhaps the most egregious one is the sort of intrinsically disordered. That kind of language, I think, is quite unhelpful. And even, although I can completely respect that might be what the church teaches on that, and that's a different matter altogether. But in terms of language, I think taking people with a certain amount of respect in terms of, for instance, I don't particularly like being called Andy.
Right.
So, I prefer people call me Andrew, right? And so there's that kind of sense where if you want respect, you've kind of got to offer it.
What is like the term to use now? Because I remember when I went to the States and I lived there, I
that's not something I'd actively choose, I'll tell you that.
Oh, well, but I this is in 2011, and I grew up in Nelson, right? Pretty insulated little town. And, we thought, we call a spade. And so when I went over there, I was like, I met this really cool Negro guy. And they were like, and I was like, what? And they're like, you don't call people Negroes. And I'm like, well, what do you call them? They're like, coloured. And they're like, oh my gosh, that's even worse. And then I was like, well, what then? And they're like, black.
Always. Well, see, that's the thing. I mean,
I thought black was the offensive term. So I'm interested actually particularly in that, in homosexual. Has that become a term that is...
It honestly depends on which country you're talking about. I mean, I have friends who live in other parts of the world, especially within Europe. And in continental Europe, the term homosexual doesn't really have that negative connotation, from what I understand. Here, I think it tends to, because, again, this is a sort of problem of, because homosexuality, again, it kind of defines it in terms of, I guess, if you like... It's a problem of when you go around and introduce yourself, you don't really go around and say like, I'm a heterosexual, this is what I mean. You go, I'm Dom, and then that's how we start. And so I think that because you start from that position of, what you do or what you desire, it doesn't really... But then again, there's also the question of, LGBT or LGBTQ, obviously a few letters are added every few years. So that, even I must admit, I find that quite hard to keep up with. But I think the whole point of it, though, is just, whatever it is, it's about beginning from a position of respect and saying, hey, how would you like to be called? We'll stick with that. And I think, for instance, Pope Francis has been really good on that in using words like gay, which really just helps people to not see it as this kind of... I think the problem is that homosexual tends to become a very medicalized language.
Gotcha.
It's trying to sort of diagnose a disorder or an illness, and that kind of thing doesn't really help much.
Right.
So there's that question. Now, the other side, which you were asking me about, is the more sort of fundamental problem, which is, as you said, when it comes to, say, a cohabiting couple, which Father Chris rightly points out, is again not in conformity with Catholic teaching. Now, the thing is that a priest can counsel a cohabiting couple to come into conformity by, not cohabiting and then going and eventually finding a process to get married. And I think this kind of goes back to a lot of the criticism that comes towards the church from within the gay community is, Christopher Hitchens is probably like a bit of a thing to mention his name, but Chris Hitchens, in a famous debate with Tony Blair, he once brought up Baron Brooks' concept of born sick and commanded to be well, and that kind of idea where it's this idea that how are you meant to, as a gay person, really come to be fully able to love and to do all of these things when there's this kind of stop already there to say, hey, you can't do that. Now, so this is I guess the point, is one of the things I admire about Catholic teaching is that, and one of the reasons why I will always consider myself a Catholic fundamentally in outlook, is this idea that you can find reason within the faith. And that there is this sense where we don't simply go in and go, well, this is what it says, and that's what we have to do. We sort of assess it in the light of reason as well, right? So part of that comes down to, I think, actually, I'll stop here because I've probably talked for way too long, and you've probably got other questions.
No.
Okay. Well, so one of the people who I've really admire is a philosopher from this university, in fact, and a virtue ethics person called Rosalind Hursthouse. Now, Rosalind Hursthouse, I don't purport to represent her views on this issue, but one of the most important things that happened to me when I went through the process of coming out was I read an article by her, typical academic of me to have...
How do I come out?
Yeah, exactly. I'll go read an article. So this article is all called Irrational Actions, and it's a great piece. And it actually talks about this idea of, well, if we desire something, does it go against reason, let's say? And one of the things she points out is this Aristotelian idea that rightly ordered reason and rightly ordered desires can coincide, and that there's no strict dichotomy between these things. So the question, of course, is where do we get to with the rightly ordered, right? Yeah. So when it comes to desire, the Church's teaching has always been, and is certainly more clearly defined now, has been that, hey, as Father Chris was saying, your love for someone is not disordered, but it's a sort of expression of that love in sexual terms that is. And so, hence, you're called to a life of chastity. Now, that's the Church's position, and I completely can respect that that is what the position is. But what I would say is that I tend to think it forecloses the debate about what could be rightly ordered homosexual relations. Right. Because it begins from a position of saying any type of homosexual relation is going to be disordered. So that's my problem, then you're sort of back to this born sick, commanded to be well. Well, I think what I would prefer is a method where we can say, well, is there a possibility that you can have rightly ordered relations?
Yeah, I think, and it's kind of getting down to, as you were saying, with on how do we address somebody who is gay? Well, by their preferred name would be a start, and so it's a case by case basis. And I think I've been doing a little research into just sin generally myself, the difference between mortal and venial and stuff.
Sure.
And I think that's really helpful in this situation, because especially when you people are very quick to say, oh, that's a mortal sin, that's a mortal sin, and that's mortal sin. Yeah. It's what more accurately you'd be saying is that's grave matter. We can't say that it's a mortal sin because someone has to do it, and they have to be in full knowledge, and they have to be fully willing to do it. And so that's really hard to navigate and understand. And so what we tend to do is just generalize. Let's just get a big thick brush and paint the whole wall. And it's like, actually, no, we need to get into the detail, into the nitty gritty. It's like as Father Chris said in his episode, yes, we're called to love everybody. You know, men and men, women and women, men and women. We're called to love. However, when to do it properly, and I think that's the question that needs to be kind of designed. It's like, how do we have, okay, fair enough, you find yourself in a situation where, you're gay, same-sex attracted, whatever you call it, and so how do I have a relationship, I suppose, is the real question. Absolutely,
yeah, I mean, that is the question, and I think that what the Church has proposed, which is fundamentally, hey, friendships, celibacy, and all of these things. And Father Chris was saying in the previous episode that, hey, he's celibate. That doesn't mean he doesn't lead a fulfilling life. And I completely agree. Except that I think what I would say is he made a choice to be celibate. And that's not a choice that everyone is going to be willing to make. Celibacy requires a certain kind of commitment. And I think the problem is that, to me, it seems to be a sort of shoehorn solution for gay people to kind of go, hey, look, it doesn't fit within our model, so the option you've got is just be nice to people and love everyone, but just don't go there. Yeah,
and that's the point I brought up at the end of that last podcast. I said, this is all great. All the Catholics will be thinking, yes, we finally, this is good. We
got
have
a
an answer
solution
to this.
Yeah.
And then at the end of it, it's like, basically what you're saying is, don't worry, if you're a homosexual, it's fine. You're allowed to have homosexual feelings. You can just never, ever act on them.
Yeah. So that's a hard thing, right? So, and the key thing that I would say is, for instance, Brendan brought up the sort of problem of the endorsement of, say, gay lifestyles, if you like. And I would say, of course, that there's a variety of them. Everything from people who've been, with one person for 50 years to, people who are going to family bar tonight. So there's that sort of variation within the gay community. And what I would say is that I think that the position of a lot of gay people has been, look, I would, if we want to bring up the moral question, a lot of gay people tend to go, it's none of your business, and I can do whatever I like. Now, I don't happen to be of that opinion, and I actually do think that there's a lot of value in looking at, and being quite frank and open and honest about looking at, what is the moral worth of gay relationships, and are different types of those relationships more morally worth it. So you can sort of see that the problem, though, is that, when you begin from a position of saying, well, that option isn't really on the table, then it becomes quite hard to, take the discussion further.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Sorry, Joe, just a quick question. Is it still recording? I thought I heard it go. Sorry. 3, 2. So good? Cool. Because I was thinking one of the things that annoys me about this whole discussion is people from either side who aren't willing to, I guess, do what we're doing and talk about it. So on the Catholic side, there are the people who are like, no, this falls under this category of must not ever discuss this. Yeah. And then on the gay side, I guess it's like well, as you said, I can do what I want. You can't tell me what to do. Which is why I think why I wanted to get you on the podcast, because you seem to have more of a a willingness to discuss it, but two, thinking about it logically, and I think the thing that makes it the hardest is when people say, well, I guess feelings get in the way, and they're just like, no, I don't want to, that's sensitive for me. And
I mean, that's the thing, is I'd say that feelings get in the way on the one side, and unfortunately, I would tend to say that the dogma does get in the way on the other side.
Right.
Well, that's at least how I see it. And
until that, until those bridges, essentially, or those walls are brought down, then there can't really be a proper solution that's found.
It's difficult, to say the least.
In terms of loving people, that's what I'm saying. We'll still be comfortable in our dogma, and you guys will still be comfortable living your lifestyles, but in terms of actually trying to say, well, how do we love everyone and not just say we love gay people, and then in fact we are refusing them in all these
Absolutely. And I mean, this is the other thing is, of course, again, Brendan and I used to move in very similar circles.
Right.
many, many years ago. But what I would say is that I'm absolutely aware that the church's teaching around marriage, for instance, is, centered around this idea of procreation and the unitive element, right? And of course, then there's this obstacle to being able to consider gay marriage as a thing, which is that, hey, you can't procreate. And of course, there's lots and lots of rebuttals to that around, questions about, well, what about barren couples, etc., etc. But my point is that I think that people should be willing to accept that, hey, there is obviously a difference between when, male and female get together and they can definitely have a kid and in a gay...
There's the potency there.
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, I don't think people should shy away from that distinction, except that I don't see it as a distinction that needs to then be about sort of having a hierarchy, if you like. Now, having said that, one of the things, again, that I admire about the church is its consistency. It has a very consistent view of these issues. Now, I happen to think that it's wrong. But
consistently wrong.
Yeah, consistently wrong. But having said that, I can fully respect the fact that there is no sort of, it doesn't have a double standard, say.
Sure.
It's quite consistent about what it conceives of as the nature of marriage, and then that's on that basis it disagrees with gay marriage, let's say. Now, where that doesn't follow, though, is on the question of civil gay marriages. And I remember, I think one of your viewers had asked the question about, should Catholics be supportive of efforts to reverse gay marriage, if that was possible, or if it was conceivable. And I would say that really it would be pretty... I don't think that there's a good case for that. Because, again, I think you have to... One of the interesting things out of this debate, probably for a lot of Catholics, is to distinguish between the sacrament of matrimony and, the civil marriage.
Well, I mean, that's what happened in Italy. When this whole marriage debate was happening in the US and everything, Italy was kind of like gay people against civil, and so all they did was made civil relationships, civil partnerships have the same legal merit as marriages within a church. And then it's they're the same thing. But that wasn't what was wanted in the States. They wanted...
I mean, this is but the word marriage comes with a lot of clout. And I think that's where a lot of that comes down to. So, I mean, I don't want to get into a debate about gay marriage.
No,
but the point is, I think that the question perhaps that the church isn't willing to ask, and say the Anglican Church is willing to ask, is, hey, okay, we're not going to have a gay wedding, let's say, within a church, but could we conceivably come to a point where we could bless a relationship, within the context of a religious service? So the Anglicans seem to be a lot more willing to do that. And I think part of that is because they are more willing to consider the question of a moral way of being, of living and loving as a gay person.
Right.
So that's sort of where I think that the problems come in the discussion like this. But in terms of whether Catholics are, bigoted or homophobic or anything like that, I'd say, by and large, probably not. Most of the people that I know, and I have a lot of Catholic friends, not really.
Wait, you're saying the ones who are by and large are not? Okay.
No, as in most people I don't think are, and I think but I think that there's definitely a lot of hurt within the church on the issue, and there's also a lot of sort of a sense of hypocrisy. The church has had a lot of very difficult issues come forward, in the last many years around sexual abuse and all of these issues, and I think a lot of it comes down to saying, well, how come we get all this focus on us when this has been going on? It's a sort of take out the log in your own eye kind of question, right?
So if we're going to wrap this up, because I know we're running out of time, but if we're going to wrap up this mini-series and say, well, is the Catholic Church homophobic? Because I think you started off by saying, you have kind of the two views on it. I mean, if you had to give us an answer now, knowing what we discussed, is it fun? Is it homophobic? Is the Catholic Church homophobic?
My answer would depend. It depends. I could probably end with a story. if you like.
Sounds good.
Yeah?
Sounds good.
So for many years, I was a very, very serious Catholic, and some of your viewers will probably know this. And I did make a really good go of living the church's teaching on the question of homosexuality. What I found, though, is, the people around me were not particularly, they were happy for me to do that. But the way that they talked about gay people, as a particularly gross example, gay turned into an acronym about greedy and yucky, which I didn't appreciate a lot. So that kind of thing does go on in certain segments, which I don't think is healthy at all.
Yeah.
Now, eventually what I came to was that I found friends and people around me, Catholic and not, who helped me to see that, hey, I can continue to have a healthy relationship with my family, a healthy relationship with friends and those around me, and with my faith in a way where I don't have to kind of segment off a particular portion of my identity. And I have found that to be personally a lot more healthy. So in that sense, I think that it depends on whether, it's that kind of distinction between the pastoral element and the doctrinal, in the sense that, on doctrine, I would of course argue that the church is pretty, has a particular kind of view that is not going to help in the case. But pastorally, I think if you went to your parish priest and said so, they'd be pretty helpful and they'd help you work your way through it. Yeah.
Cool.
So it's almost like, there are people within the church that you would maybe categorize as homophobic, people, and maybe there's even people that would be, accidentally homophobic, saying, oh, that's so gay and stuff like that in a derogatory term.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, even I do that from time to time, as you probably got from the outtakes on this. But no, it's actually not even in terms of homophobia, right? Like, Brendan brought up the idea about that homophobia tends to be an overused term. I'm not sure that I fully agree with that, but I'm willing to accept that there's certainly a lot of sensitivity, and I think that that sensitivity does come from a particular history, but maybe doesn't have as much of a basis now. And I think that some people can have genuine disagreements but continue to be people of goodwill. And I think that that's what maybe this podcast to me has shown, is that you can kind of hash out some issues even if you have some pretty fundamental disagreements, and that's
right.
Kind of okay.
Like if we, I mean, and that's the thing, like, because if you and I were to go, to a priest, and it was kind of like, or we get put in a situation where we're then asked to, act upon what we believe in regards to the situation, I'm sure we'd still come down with some different opinions.
Totally.
Like my view on the morality or whatever of homosexual relationships. It will be different for yours, but the important thing is that you start, I think, like you were saying, Tom, you start with the person, right, and don't see anyone really as like some kind of a reason to start a moral argument. They're a person. If you truly have the best interests in mind, then you'll want to speak the truth in love, and there's never room for just straight up being a douche about it.
Exactly, and I think that goes both ways, right?
Certainly
talking to people, especially say older people who've lived through a different time. Right. I think for a lot of gay people, that's something that we come to accept, is that, hey, people will not necessarily be as open to certain ideas, and that doesn't mean they're a bad person. It could, to me, I think they're wrong, and I do think that objectively, but we obviously will disagree on that. But that's okay. Like, we can still go and have a beer afterwards. I think that's sort of the point, right?
But any concluding thoughts?
I think it's just a case of don't get too caught up in terms, like, what is homophobic, what is homosexual, what is, like, at the end of the day, we're called to a relationship with Christ. We're called to be in communion with Christ, and to the best of our ability, which isn't very good because we're human. That's all we can do, and so love one another, and let's try and walk this path together.
I would agree, but the only thing I'd say is, even more important than loving one another is subscribing to this channel,
100%.
Gregorian Chat, and make sure that
Absolutely.
you comment. Leave your comments below because there's been some good ones so far, and we want to. I mean, why limit the conversation to just this? You know,
Absolutely.
And thank you for listening. Thank you so much for coming on, Andrew.
Thank you for having me on.
wrapping it up.
It's been
and,
good fun.
yeah.
And it's nice to, I also, do I get the pleasure of being the first person to be interviewed in your new premises?
Oh yeah,
This
of
is
course.
true,
Brand
yeah.
New, a brand new chapel.
We could just give like a little bit of a camera swivel here and show. Well, firstly we have Joe Monopolio.
The cameraman snoozing behind the camera.
So over here we've got the new kitchen for Newman Hall. It's pretty legit. This is like an interrogation room.
Yeah, that's what it's here for.
Anyway, but thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
We'll see you guys next time.
God bless.
ya.
Bye.
Hey guys, thanks for watching the podcast. I've got good news. It just got a whole lot easier to search for us online.
All you got to do is search Gregorian Chat into YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, iTunes, and Player FM for those who are on Android.
Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe. See you later. God bless.